Okay, today we're going to talk about Michael Oakeshott's On Being Conservative. And to start, I think it's important that Oakeshott believes that conservatism is best described as a disposition rather than as a particular as a particular philosophy or a set of principles or something with more specific content. So as we go through this, I want to think of this as less specific and more of a sensibility, right? More of an approach of the way someone um, navigates the world believing a set of um, general ideas rather than specific notions or specific policies. Okay, to begin with, um, in the second paragraph, Oakeshott argues that conservatives tend to use and enjoy the present, that the present is the most valuable thing that we have, and so we must enjoy it and sort of dwell in it a little bit rather than looking toward the future or merely being in the past. He says we're grateful for what the past has given us as conservatives, but we don't idolize it. That is to say, we don't try to go back to the past or say things should be as they were in the past, but rather we value um, a sense of tradition, a sense of development, a sense of movement from the past to the present. So we don't idolize the past, but we respect it. Third, conservatives prefer the familiar over the foreign. And this is a central tenet for Oakeshott. For Oakeshott, what is most familiar to us is the most valuable to us. It's what gives us our sense of identity, our sense of meaning, our sense of understanding in the world is to be familiar with something. So foreignness or otherness or difference is a disruption. It takes us out of the familiar and therefore is less comfortable and more of a threat to who we are, what we understand. On the bottom of page 1, Oakeshott argues that conservatives prefer the tried to the untried, the fact to the mystery, the actual to the possible, limited to the unbounded, near to the distant, sufficient to the superabundant, convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. Again, I think there's a long list in here that clearly articulates that conservatives just enjoy what we have. They're not looking to dramatically change anything. They're not fooled by huge promises of a perfect future or a real romanticization of the past, but rather just a notion that here and now is important and it is good and we should enjoy it, right? Not that it is perfect, not that it is a utopia, but that it is the best because it is here, because it is familiar, because we are here to behold it. Okay, so the next major thing that he talks about, and I think this is a central and fundamental concern of conservatives, is the notion of change. For Oakeshott, change is something that must be accommodated, and it is never easy to change. It is never easy to accommodate difference. That's the violent nature of change, that we must adjust to something new. And he says that there's always a risk of loss, right? Which is why we should be averse to changes, especially big changes. That conservatives believe that no matter what, whatever the change is, it will absolutely constitute a loss. And what is it that we're losing? Well, we're losing the familiar. We're losing the status quo. We're losing what we have now anytime there's a change. That is not to say that we must reject all changes, only that we must weigh any benefit of any change against the absolute loss that that change will entail. And again, that loss is losing whatever we have now. So thus, conservatives don't believe that change doesn't happen. Rather, they believe change is inevitable, but it's something that we must adapt to, and this adaptation requires energy and loss. And so we should prefer changes that are a little bit more slow, that are more incremental, that are subtle, that are specific, rather than they're rapid and broad and widespread and dramatic. Those are the changes that are most difficult to accommodate. So again, it is not to say that conservatives despise change, only that they want to temper its progress. They want to slow its rate and its scope so that it's more easy to digest. We should evaluate proposed changes based on how much of a disturbance it causes to us. That is to say, if a change is proposed, we should say, let's evaluate it based on how much change, how much disturbance, how much disruption it will cause in our lives. right? And that disruption, again, is always a negative. It could also come with some benefits, right? Change is not always bad. But again, those benefits must outweigh the certain loss that those disturbances will cause. Um, so again, for Oakeshott, it's a matter of taking change in stride, right? And making sure that it's not so severe or so radical that we would have a hard time working through it. Relatedly, conservatives evaluate innovation not as a bad thing necessarily, but as something that we must be wary of. Innovation, conservatives argue, always often leads to something greater than expected, right? So a small innovation may be proposed, right, or discovered, and it says it will just fix this little problem. But conservatives often are suspicious of these claims of a limited change, and they say, well, even though the intention may be that the innovation only solves this little problem, it may have these ripple effects that impact our lives in much more general and broad ways, and therefore we should always be a little bit suspicious of innovations, even if they appear small, right? And again, this is for similar reasons, that each innovation entails certain loss and a possible gain. Therefore, the burden is always on the innovator to say, this is a specific problem that we will solve, and these are the limits of those changes that will result in disturbances in our lives, right? And so for Oakeshott, this change and innovation, but especially innovation, should resemble growth rather than radical change, right? It should be a development of exactly what we're doing now. So it should be a movement from the familiar that we deal with right now to something just a little bit different that has a little bit of innovation that improves something specific for us. And in connection with this, the innovation is always better when it is a response to a particular defect, something very specific, right? A bug that is to be fixed rather than a completely new invention, right? An update to your phone rather than a brand new operating system. Although I don't think Oakeshott would be super into smartphones. But the idea is to say, yeah, we can make minor improvements to life, but the way we do that is we say, here's a tiny little hiccup, right? Here's a tiny little problem that gets in the way or is annoying. Let's figure out a workaround for that that won't dramatically change the whole framework, won't dramatically change our whole lifestyle or how we operate in our lives, but will just be a small change, right? That will eliminate an inconvenience, right? While still valuing what the present is. And this minimizes what we lose, which is, say, the familiar, and maximizes what we gain, which is something a little bit more convenient, a little bit easier. And again, conservatives prefer innovation and change that is slow rather than fast. And this is for lots of reasons. One is that for the reason we gave at the top of the slide here, that impacts are often greater than expected. So we want to be able to evaluate them along the way, right? Slowly implement on a limited basis and check in, right? See how things are going. See if that change is as anticipated, and if so, then we can sort of slowly implement on a larger scale. But if not, then we can back away or shift gears or try to develop a new strategy. But if we do it quickly, then we don't have those options. So for Oakeshott, the benefits of implementing the change are always less than the risks of what a widespread quick innovation would be. So again, this is a notion of prudence. Enjoy rather than exploit, right? Resist the promise of something perfect in the future. Resist the idea that an innovation will solve all your problems, but rather enjoy the nature of the status quo. This is the conservative disposition. Okay, what about human nature? For conservatives, this is on page 3. He says change is tiring, change is dangerous, change is exhausting. It generates sadness rather than exhilaration. That humans are not intended to radically evolve in this sense. He says over the last 5 centuries, time has gone too quickly. And notice he doesn't say the last 10 years or last 20 years, right? He thinks in terms of really long scales. He says 5 centuries, life has dramatically changed, right? And so we need to slow that pace in order to enjoy the present and produce a life that's more, that can adapt to changes at a slower rate. Okay, particular benefits. And he argues that we can't take conservatism too far, that conservatism is a limited disposition. It shouldn't be the definition of every activity that we undertake. For instance, He says, if you constantly go to the store to get the same thing that you want and they stop selling it, the conservative disposition doesn't dictate that you must continue going to that store because it's familiar, right? Even though the familiar is always a good thing, that it shouldn't be such a, what he calls a hardcore ideology, but rather a disposition. So you could say to the shopkeeper, try to convince them to carry what you want to buy. The shopkeeper could try to get new customers that don't need what you've been buying. That everybody can change in these types of relationships. And he lists a number of these relationships that says these are areas where conservative disposition might get in the way. It shouldn't monopolize one's life. It should just be a guiding set of principles that we move through. The other foundational claim that for Oakeshott is central is that no principle, no ideology, and no disposition ought to be imposed on anyone else, right? This is the grounding notion for conservatives, is that whatever your principles are, they must be yours and yours alone, right? You can, of course, communicate them to others. You may sort of market them and pitch them, but you can never or should never try to impose them any belief system on anyone else. This is the sacred ground of our own ability to pursue our own best interests. So it says conservatism is like a brake. It's like a governor on a car that prevents it from going too fast, from an engine from overheating. The society appears to prefer change, all these whims, all these passions. Conservative disposition slows that down. It breaks that society. These are the places that it's not beneficial that I mentioned. Those are listed on page 4. Conservatives, as 3 examples, Oakeshott mentions friends, fishing, and tools. And I think these are perfect examples of what conservative ideology likes. Friends, fishing, and tools. Why friends? Well, for Oakeshott, it's important that we value what we have rather than attempting to constantly replace what we have. And friends are a good example of this. Making new friends is not always better than enjoying the friends that you have. A conservative would say what makes a friend is that they're familiar, that you know them, right? That you have a history with them. And so just replacing them would make no sense. It runs counter to the idea of friends. If you do make new friends, you should do so slowly and without just simply replacing old friends. And it should be radically different than your relationship with your old friends. So friends are sort of a good example of how we should see the present. Something that's familiar, something we have a history with, something we enjoy, something that we like just because we like it, and that we can't replace it easily. Fishing is an activity that's not goal-oriented. The idea is not to simply catch fish, but rather to enjoy the process of fishing. We do it because it's familiar, because it allows us to dwell in the present moment. And it's not just to be productive, and it's not just to be efficient, and it's not to accomplish a specific goal, but rather just to enjoy an activity. That's sort of fishing as a conservative idea, right? No surprise, conservatives like fishing. Finally, tools. And this is sort of a metaphor for the larger strategy of conservative politics, but they don't change very frequently, right? Old tools are really good tools. The best tools are the ones that we're most familiar with. We can always go to those tools. We know exactly how they work. We know where we can use them. And when we encounter new problems or new projects or new dilemmas, we should turn to our familiar tools because they will help us solve the new problems, right? Conservatives say if a new problem crops up, it would be doubly dangerous to develop new tools to try to address that problem. Rather, we must use something that's familiar to address something that's unfamiliar, because that gives us the best shot of working our way through it. So tools they have lots of different uses. They don't change rapidly over time. One tool can be used for lots and lots of things. They are sort of part of a repertoire that we're familiar with. These are the types of political strategies and ideas that conservatives like. Okay, I will pick it up there on the next recording.